Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. We are still in Mental Health Awareness Month. It's the month of May. Today, I want to talk about, the U.S. national security and um, the suicides of some of our early national security leaders. By the way, what I'm discussing is not classified information. Everything is actually in the public domain, right? So it's unclassified or declassified. This is in the public domain. It's not classified information. I had to give that disclaimer. So it's interesting. So on uh, in 1947, the through the national there was the National Security Act, which was signed by our president at the time, Harry Truman, which reorganized the U.S. military establishment, and it created the framework for the what came to be known as the Department of Defense. So it was called the Department of War then. Now it's called Department of War again. Of course, for a long time since 1949, up to this President Trump's second presidency as number 47. It just became changed to the Department of War. I don't know how long that's going to last, but it became the Department of Defense through the National Security Act of 1947, and also that created the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. Of course, the CIA had a predecessor because it was due for wartime intelligence gathering. It was called the Office of Strategic Services, and so you see many of our early CIA leaders were part of the Office of Strategic Services, which was established, or it operated during wartime when we were at war, especially during the Second World War. So, but the CIA was established in 1947 as our, as our first civilian peacetime era intelligence gathering agency. It became independent, answerable to the President of the United States. And of course, the Department of Defense was established, and the U.S. Air Force, then became independent, was established because what we had was, the Air Force was part of the U.S. Army, and so the U.S. Air Force, became established as a standalone department. And our first Secretary of Defense was a guy called James Vincent Forrestal. James Vincent Forrestal. He had been the Secretary of the Navy up until that time. The Department of the Navy had been a cabinet level position, so they attended cabinet meetings. But with the establishment of the Department of Defense, that was replaced. The Department of the Navy no longer was a cabinet level position, but the Secretary of the Navy became answerable to the Department of the Secretary of the Department of Defense, and of course the Department of the Navy was subsumed uh, under the Department of Defense. Now, our first Secretary of Defense was, as I said, James Vincent Forrestal. James Vincent Forrestal was a very accomplished man. He was known as a workaholic, and unfortunately, on May 22nd, 1949, so just about 77 years to this day, May 22nd, 1949, he plunged to his death from the 16th floor of the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. Maryland again. And so he plunged to his death. He was wearing just the bottom half of his pajamas. And he left a suicide note. Interestingly, his suicide note um, uh, was quoting a Greek tragedy by Sophocles called Ajax, right? Ajax. Uh, I'm gonna do a video and discuss Operation. Well, discuss Ajax. The Operation and Operation Ajax. I've mentioned Operation Ajax before. Operation Ajax was the first CIA led um, coup d'etat in a foreign land, of course. and it overthrew the government of Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh and replaced him with the U.S. friendly Shah, consolidated his power. That's Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, of course, who was later overthrown in 1979. But Operation Ajax is what uh, was planned by the CIA to overthrow um, the Prime Minister Mohammed uh, Mossadegh in 1953. Now, that that Operation Ajax, was led by. I've done a video discussing Kermit Roosevelt, who was a grandson of um, the grandson of 26th President Teddy Roosevelt. Uh, Kermit Roosevelt, however, while he led the operation on ground, he was actually answering to a man called Frank Wisner. Frank Wisner was at the time was director of plans, right? That was what it was called. It was initially called Office of uh, uh, Policy Coordination. So it was really set up for uh, clandestine services, sabotage, counterintelligence, and sabotage overseas, and propaganda. They were the masters of disinformation, and so they did a lot of things. But Frank Wisner is the guy I want to talk about today. Interestingly, Frank Wisner himself would commit suicide in 1965. He would suffer from nervous exhaustion. And so it's interesting that so he was one of the first leaders of the CIA. And of course, that's what I'm discussing today. How, interestingly, our first Secretary of Defense, committed suicide by plunging to his death. His suicide note was a quotation of Sophocles' um, Ajax, right? And that Ajax, it's funny, became the name of this. He committed suicide. That's um, James Forrestal committed suicide in 1949, May 22nd, 1949. But the Operation Ajax did not occur until 1953. And that was, of course, as I said, that was what executed the planned and executed the overthrow of Mohammed uh, Mossadegh. Mohammed Mossadegh, and established and consolidated the rule of um, uh, uh, Mohammed Shah Reza Pahlavi. So, in any event, what I want to talk about today is a little bit give the background uh, of Frank Wisner. So Frank Wisner, interestingly, was one who hired Kermit Roosevelt. So Frank Wisner, interesting, he'd worked in the Navy. He'd been a commander in the U.S. Navy, and he'd been recruited in the Office of Strategic Services. That's what was the intelligence arm of the United States Army military at the time. The CIA didn't I've discussed that the CIA didn't exist in the beginning, but and many other people who would join the early leaders of the CIA, including Alan Dulles, who was the first civilian director of the CIA. He also worked in the Office of Strategic Services. Now, Alan Dulles was actually the boss of Frank Wisner. And so Frank Wisner, at some point, he works in the Office of Strategic Services. And after the war, he was now recruited by um, the Secretary of State, a guy called, was it Dan Atkinson? But anyway, the Secretary of State recruited him, and so he becomes Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of Occupied Areas, right? So you see the link. If you're used to reading espionage novels, like I used to do as a kid, I used to read a lot of Robert Ludlum novels and Frederick Forsyth. They like to write about espionage, right? Born Identity, Born is a series. I read so many of them. Born Identity, Born Ultimatum, Aquitaine Protect, Progression, Gemini Contenders. I read a bunch of them as a kid. So you notice that they normally like to station CIA officers in embassies, in the Department of State. They normally sort of like have a subterfuge, a fake job, a dummy job within the Department of State. So you see, that's what's it's a common theme feature in espionage novels. So you see how Frank Wisner, he sort of like was like the blueprint of this pattern because he started off working in the Department of State. Now, there was an office that was created called the Office of Policy Coordination, in which he was working, and they were actually answerable to the Department of State, but executed things on behalf of the CIA, which was established in 1947. It's interesting that I'm connecting Frank Wisner's, as a blueprint for some of these espionage novels, right? How they have a dual role. They're sort of working in the Department of State as a cover. They're using the Department of State and an American embassy as a cover, and they're really working for the CIA. It's interesting that Frank Wisner was actually a friend of um, Ian Fleming. He was a friend of Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming, the author of um, the creator of James Bond, the James Bond 007, right? Ian Fleming, of course, he himself had been a spy, had worked in British intelligence, right? He'd worked in British intelligence. Um, and it's interesting that this guy, Frank Wisner, he was a sociable guy because he knew several people. He'd worked, interestingly, for a double agent, right? The turncoat, British turncoat, Kim Philby, right? Kim Philby had been a spy. He was one of the top MI6 officials. That's the British intelligence, but he had been a double agent. He had been working for the KGB, and he was stationed in Washington D.C. And so this guy Frank Wisner had been working closely with Kim Philby. Now, Frank Wisner was not a double agent. He was not working against America on behalf of Russia. In fact, he was very anti Russia. They thought to a manic level. They thought he was obsessed with, uh, you know, with being, he was sort of, if they could call him a racist against Russians, they would say, well, that's what Frank Wisner was. Because he was obsessed with Russia, against communists. He was very anti, communists, and I mean, so he was known for that. And but even though he was of course loyal to the United States. He was actually investigated at some point. He was investigated because the FBI had concerns. J. Edgar Hoover had him investigated because he'd apparently had an affair with a Romanian um, a Romanian princess, um, and so it was he was investigated by the FBI, but he was cleared though. He was cleared. They said he was fine. But so he had a very interesting life. Of course, I was talking about how his life was sort of created some kind of blueprint for spy novels. Because something else that he did. He was a very good friend of another man who committed suicide. I've talked about him. That's Philip Graham, who was the head of the publisher of the Washington Post. I've done a video discussing him with regard to the Washington Post's role in exposing the Watergate scandal. So Philip Graham and his wife Catherine Graham had been very close friends with this guy. Um, uh, Frank Wisner and his wife Polly. So they'd been very good. They dined together, hung out together. So they were part of what was called the Georgetown set, right? And that, of course, it explains some of the controversy regarding the CIA and the media, because there's another video I'm going to do discussing how, um, as I said, Carl Bernstein wrote an article for the Rolling Stone in October 20, 1977, in which he alleged that the CIA had an arrangement with the media in which um, major media houses um, were used as cover for CIA operatives, right? So that's something else. But you could see how top officials of the CIA, like Frank Wisner, who I'm discussing today, how their social engagement, right, their close social ties with major publishers, heads of major publishing publications like Washington Post boss Philip Graham could lead to those insinuations or could facilitate such arrangements, right? Such cover arrangements for the CIA using the media. But interestingly, let me get back to the story of Frank Wisner. So Frank Wisner would go on to be the boss who authorized Operation Ajax because Mohammed Mossadegh was believed to have been threatening the interests um, of Western oil interests in Iran and in the Middle East. And so, um, although uh, they call their plan Operation Ajax, it's ostensibly in reference to the cleaning so the cleaning agent, Ajax, right? The idea was to clean out all anti-American interest in Iran. But again, it's kind of interesting that Ajax is actually a famous Greek tragedy written by Sophocles, which was actually um, used as a suicide note by the first Secretary of Defense in 1949. James V. Forrestal had used that a passage quoted translation from Sophocles' tragedy Ajax. And I should discuss what that tragedy was. It's interesting that Ajax was he was a Greek warrior who was disgraced, right? And of course, I love the classics. So he, um, I've talked about Odysseus, right? Odysseus, who was written, Homer wrote the Odyssey, and Odysseus is the protagonist. So Odysseus is Odysseus of the Nimblewoods was supposed to be very, very clever, and he was favored by the gods. And so what happened was Ajax had wanted the armor of Achilles, right? But they gave it instead to weapons of Achilles were given to Odysseus, and so it made Ajax jealous, right? Because Ajax thought he deserved it, and he was jealous, and so he had a plot to to kill Greek leaders, including Agamemnon, and Menelaus. So he was going to kill these uh, Greek leaders, Agamemnon and Menelaus. Like I said, forgive me if I butcher the pronunciation. But eventually, what happened was the Greek god, the goddess Athena, would intervene, and Athena would like to intervene. She intervened. If you read the Odyssey, you see how she intervened on behalf of Odysseus as well. So she intervenes and made Ajax crazy. She actually literally makes him crazy, and so he, instead of fighting and killing his enemies, he actually fights and butchers animals. So he kills these animals, thinking they were his enemies, the leaders he had plotted to kill. So when he found out that he had just killed, when he came to and realized he had actually just killed animals, he felt disgraced, and he felt the only way out was for him to commit suicide, and that will restore his honor. So he ends up committing suicide. But it's interesting that Odysseus, he was a very cunning person. That's when you read the Greek tragedy, the stories of, the Greek classics, and you read of Odysseus, you see how clever he is. Odysseus was the one who planned. Everybody knows of the Trojan horse, right? Odysseus was the one who planned the gift of using a Trojan horse, right, to put soldiers inside a wooden horse so they could steal into Troy. So Odysseus, though, he also showed his empathy after Ajax committed suicide, and he prevailed on having a fitting burial um, for Ajax because Agamemnon would not, he refused to have him buried in an honorable way, but Odysseus prevailed on him. So it's interesting that, madness and suicide had to do with uh, the tragedy Ajax, written by Sophocles. And that was the suicide note left by the first Secretary of Defense who plunged to his death. I'll do a quick video, and explain why James Forrestal might have quoted, left the Greek tragedy Ajax um, as his suicide note. But in any event, uh, something else that going back to Frank Wisner was not only involved in the Operation Ajax that overthrew the Iranian prime minister. He was also involved in what came to be known as Operation Fortune, right, to overthrow the Guatemalan president at the time, uh, Jacobo Arbenz. Jacobo Arbenz, that's his name. Uh, that was his name. He was overthrown in 1954, uh, and he was replaced with a guy called Camilo Armas, who was more favorable to U.S. interests, and he was, unfortunately, though, he turned out to be a bloody and brutal dictator, and eventually he was also executed. He was killed in 1957, and eventually Guatemala plunged into an over 30-year civil war from 1960 to 1996. So you can see how CIA intervention wasn't so great after all, especially planned by Frank Wisner. Um, Frank Wisner also is involved in the infiltration, well, not infiltration, the US absorption of Nazis, right? Former Nazis, especially from Belarusia, right? From Belarusians. So former Nazis were brought into the United States, and they were naturalized in violation of US federal law. Um, Eventually, though, Frank Wisner would break down in 1958. He would suffer a nervous breakdown, and he would subsequently retire from the CIA in 1962. I got some of this from a book called The Determined Spy, written by Douglas Waller. And, there are indications, suggestions that maybe he felt guilty as a result of his activities in the CIA, coordinating overthrows that led to a lot of deaths and hardships. I don't know, but anyway, he was diagnosed with manic depression, which is also called bipolar disorder, and so he would undergo electroshock therapy, electroshock treatment, which is what they used back then. And he retired from the CIA in 1962. He eventually committed suicide in 1965. So that's the tragic lives of early CIA leaders. I'm going to continue with the discussion of James Forrestal, and I want to keep this just under 25 minutes. My name's Oluro Timiosha. I will keep you posted. Thank you.